Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something specific, something foundational. We're looking purely at the early years of Catherine the Great.
Right, before the Empress.
Exactly. From her birth in 1729, right up until she lands in Russia in 1744. Our mission, really, is to get a handle on this young woman, Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst. Who was she before she became Ekaterina Alexievna?
Yeah, and that's crucial, isn't it? Because, so many accounts just jump straight into the power plays, the coup, the reign. But the sources, they really show that the Catherine who took the throne was forged in this very specific environment back in Germany.
Yeah.
A minor court, discipline, maybe even a little desperate.
Right. So we need to dissect that world, the upbringing, the education, the politics in Prussia that somehow set her up for this unbelievable trajectory.
Yeah, what prepared her for Russia?
We've got some fascinating material here. Notes on her family's actual status, which wasn't grand, articles detailing her education, pretty rigorous stuff. And then the sheer politics behind how a princess from, well, nowhere significant gets picked for the Russian throne. It's all about ambition and adapting, isn't it?
Absolutely. Adaptation is the key word.
Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start with the basics. Stettin. Sophie Friedrich August von Anhalt-Zerbst, born May 2nd, 1729. Stettin, Prussia back then. Now, Schütz, Poland. What was that world like for a minor princess?
Well, think orderly, but small scale. Stettin was a northern European port city, on the Oder River, lots of red brick fortified walls. But the key thing is it was a world of, let's say, limited means.
Not exactly imperial splendor.
Not at all. The economy was small-time trade, shipping, local crafts, all under pretty strict Prussian administration. It wasn't a place of vast wealth or, sweeping power.
And the climate itself, we sometimes forget geography. Temperate, right. Mild summers, winters that got cold but weren't Siberian.
Right. Average summers, maybe 18-20 Celsius. Winters sometimes dipping below -5. Manageable.
Yeah. And that really sets up a huge physical contrast later on, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. But maybe even more telling than the weather was the financial and political climate. Her father, Christian August, minor German prince.
Very minor.
Very minor. The sources are clear. Limited wealth, known mostly for his military career. This is that fragmented Holy Roman Empire reality we talk about. Hundreds of little principalities.
Lots of titles, not much clout.
Exactly. High status on paper, maybe, but very little actual influence. So Sophie's born into this world of, well, relative scarcity and strict discipline that really shapes her outlook,
That lack of power, that scarcity, it almost immediately makes you look at her mother, Johanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp. She seems like the real engine here.
Oh, completely. Johanna Elizabeth was, well, the opposite of her husband in ambition. She was driven, very well educated for the time, fluent in French, which was vital, and German.
The language of court.
The language of everything. Important, really. And she was constantly networking, writing to rulers across Europe. She knew her husband was sort of stuck in his military roles, but she saw the bigger picture. She saw Sophie as the ticket.
So the home environment, it had that strict Protestant German field discipline, obedience, order.
Very much so.
But layered on top was this intense intellectual program driven by the mother, far beyond what you might expect. Let's talk curriculum.
Yeah, it was pretty demanding. German, obviously, her native tongue. But huge emphasis on French, not just as a language, but as the key to accessing court life, diplomacy, the intellectual world of the 18th century.
With the international language.
It really was.
Yeah.
And then you add basic Latin, history, geography, literature, music, all the etiquette training, of course.
Yeah.
Religion, naturally. Even some basic science. This wasn't just finishing school for a local marriage.
No, this was grooming for something bigger.
And what's really striking is the early exposure to Enlightenment ideas. Now, she wasn't, debating Rousseau at age 12.
Right.
But through accessible texts, through her mother's library and connections, she was encountering ideas about reason, governance, natural law. The sources suggest this foundation was there before Russia.
So those seeds of her later enlightened despot image, her letters with Voltaire, they were planted back in Stettin, amidst all that discipline.
I think so. It's a fascinating mix, isn't it? That strict upbringing combined with this intellectual curiosity.
So you have the education, the discipline. What about her personally? What did people observe about young Sophie?
Well, the words that come up again and again are intelligent, ambitious, curious, and she learned fast, retained information incredibly well.
Almost photographic, some say.
Something like that. Physically, she was apparently quite small, delicate as a child, often described as serious, reflective. But the standout trait, the one everyone noted, was resilience. adaptability. She could pick up languages, master court manners, absorb new situations.
And that adaptability wasn't just a nice personality trait, was it? It was
It
currency.
was her main political asset. Absolutely. It's what made her a viable candidate.
Which brings us right to that moment, the political selection. This is where things get, well, incredibly high stakes. Marriages were diplomacy, pure and simple. How does a girl from tiny Anhalt-Zerbst even get considered for Russia?
Two things, mainly. First, her mother's nonstop networking. Johanna Elizabeth was relentless. Second, a crucial family connection. Empress Elizabeth of Russia needed a bride for her heir, her nephew, Grand Duke Peter.
Who was already known to be difficult.
Understatement, immature, unstable. Peter himself was from the Holstein-Gottorp line, same as Sophie's mother, so that made Sophie a distant cousin. It was a link, however tenuous.
But there were other German princesses, surely. Why Sophie? This decision in 1744 feels pivotal.
Well, the Russian court needed someone who could integrate fast. Given Peter's issues, they weren't just looking for a wife for him. They were looking for someone who could potentially stabilize the dynasty's future.
Someone manageable but capable.
Exactly. Sophie's reported intelligence, her proven adaptability, maybe even her mother's assurances that she'd be compliant. It all made her seem like the best bet. The candidate most likely, at just 15, to ditch her German roots and fully embrace Russia.
That gamble, that expectation.
Yeah.
It meant the change had to be instant. Total. She leaves Stettin, this small, orderly world.
And boom. She's dropped into the massive, centralized, rapidly expanding Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. It's not just a move, it's like landing on another planet.
A complete cultural demolition of her past life.
Totally. And the demands were immediate. First, the religious conversion. Huge. She was raised Lutheran, strict Protestant, discipline, scripture. Now she has to become Russian Orthodox. Essential for acceptance by the people, the church, the elite. Non-negotiable.
And the name change comes with it.
Ekaterina Alexeyevna.
Catherine.
New name, new religion, and she had to learn the language like yesterday.
Where the sources say she threw herself into it.
Absolutely. Intensive study the moment she arrived.
Yeah?
Russian language, Russian culture, the incredibly complex, almost Byzantine etiquette of the imperial court. They say she'd stay up all night practicing Russian, nearly made herself sick.
I guess she knew.
She knew it was survival. Mastery meant acceptance, maybe even influence. Failure meant, well, being sent back wasn't really an option she could contemplate.
And contrast that Stettin life. Small castle, small city, few tutors with St. Petersburg. Huge, opulent palaces, constant scrutiny from this powerful, suspicious nobility, people who could destroy her, regardless of her title.
It was a pressure cooker, a crucible, really. Think about the psychological weight, the strict hierarchy, knowing her position was shaky, plus the physical shock of the climate. Temperatures way below -20°C.
A world away from the Baltic coast.
Totally. Every single skill she'd honed in Germany, the discipline, the French, the quick learning, it was all immediately tested just to stay afloat. It wasn't about thriving yet, it was about surviving that initial shock.
So we've traced her path. Sophie Friederike Gust, from that small German principality, through this intense, mother-driven education, right to the moment she becomes Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Grand Duchess of Russia. She's only 15.
Yeah, the whole transformation happens by 15. It shows you Catherine the Great didn't just appear. She was the end product of incredible resilience, yes, but also years of strategic planning by her mother, which Sophie then had to execute under immense pressure. She learned how to read a room, play the game, perform the role long before she aimed for the throne itself.
So for you listening, try and understand this historical figure. What does this all mean? Those first 15 years, they weren't just backstory. They were the intense training ground.
Right. And maybe here's the thought to leave you with. Think about that drastic shift. From that relatively small, ordered Protestant German world and its temperate climate to the immense, volatile, Orthodox Russian court in freezing St. Petersburg. How much of the, Catherine, we know later, the political ruthlessness, the sheer drive, how much of that was simply the survival instinct she had to perfect during those first incredibly demanding years in a foreign, often hostile environment?
Was it ambition driving her? Or was it the absolute necessity of never, ever having to go back to being that insignificant German princess she fought so hard to leave behind? That question really hangs over her entire story, doesn't it?
1744. A 15-year-old girl turns up in St. Petersburg. She's come all the way from Stettin, across Prussia, the Baltic territories.
Yeah, and it wasn't an easy trip. We're talking weeks in carriages, then a ship across the Gulf of Finland. Think cold, wind, rain, snow, A real taste of what was to come.
Absolutely. And that's our focus today, isn't it? Those crucial 18 years from her arrival in 44 right up to 1762, her Russian apprenticeship, you could call it.
That's a good way to put it. Because she arrived as this German outsider, and over those years, she had to systematically, well, become someone else entirely to even survive, let alone thrive.
So our mission here is to look at the sources, unpack how she managed it, how she navigated that incredibly treacherous court, converted, learned everything from scratch,
Yeah.
and basically set the stage for becoming, well, Catherine the Great.
And the first thing that really hits you from the sources is just how immediate the pressure was. There was no easing in. She had to shed her old identity right away.
It wasn't a choice.
Not at all. Culturally, politically, spiritually. She had to become Russian, full stop. Otherwise, she was out before she even started.
And that spiritual side, the conversion, that seems like the biggest initial wall. It wasn't just, ticking a box. Her whole Lutheran German background had to be publicly erased.
Completely. There was a formal ceremony, a renunciation of her Protestant faith, and that's when she got her new name, Ekaterina Alexeyevna.
Ekaterina?
Yes. And the sources really suggest this wasn't just symbolic. It was almost like a psychological commitment. By publicly ditching her German roots and embracing Orthodoxy, she slammed the door in her past.
Made her totally reliant on the Russian system.
Exactly. It forced her hand. There was no going back. It was a profound political statement. I am one of you now.
So after the ceremony, she then had to live it, right? Every single day, not just showing up at church.
Oh, much more than that. She had to master these incredibly complex ancient Orthodox rituals and the public piety. It had to be intense, visible. Few foreigners ever really managed that level of performance.
Why was the bar set so high?
Well, you have to understand, the Russian Orthodox Church back then, it wasn't separate from the state. It was fused with imperial power. It demanded absolute obedience, strict adherence to ritual, very public displays of faith.
So any hesitation on her part
Would have been fatal, seen as foreign, subversive, untrustworthy. So adopting the faith wasn't really about personal belief, initially anyway. It was the key, the absolute key to gaining any kind of cultural legitimacy.
Okay, so she clears that massive hurdle, but then comes the everyday learning. It sounds exhausting. We often focus on the court intrigue, but she had a whole curriculum to get through.
An absolutely grueling one, starting with the language.
Russian, obviously.
Yes, intensive Russian.
Yeah.
Daily lessons, tutors, mentors at court. But not just conversational Russian. She also had to tackle Church Slavonic for the religious side of things.
Which is quite different, I understand.
Very different, linguistically complex. So it was total immersion. And she wasn't just passively receiving it either.
What do you mean?
The sources show she was incredibly proactive. While the tutors covered the basics, she was digging into Russian history, how the administration worked, imperial law, all on her own initiative.
Wow. So she wasn't just trying to fit in. She was already studying how the whole machine worked.
Precisely. It wasn't about passing exams. It was about understanding the state she just might, one day lead.
That's fascinating. But was it all just books and tutors, or did the physical reality of Russia play a part in this education?
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point. It's easy to picture the gilded palaces, but life in St. Petersburg was physically demanding, brutally so.
The famous Russian winter.
Exactly. She had to adapt instantly. Heavy snow, intense cold. Getting around meant sleds for months on end. Palace heating was, let's just say, not up to modern standards.
Right.
And even the food. Heavy soups, rye bread, fish, dairy. Just surviving the winter, managing the local diet, and during the physical side of it. That itself sent a message. It was kind of political signal. Look, I can handle this. I can endure what you endure.
That really grounds the story, doesn't it? Trying to learn court politics while you're freezing and struggling with a new language. But you mentioned the palaces. The court itself. That sounds like an even colder environment, emotionally speaking.
It really was. St. Petersburg, Peter the Great built it to be this grand European showcase. Baroque architecture, canals, very impressive.
But the atmosphere inside the court...
Damp. Foggy.
Yeah.
Psychologically draining. Think of it like a pressure cooker. Strict dress codes, endless formal events, and, maybe the worst part, constant surveillance. Everyone watching everyone.
Sounds paranoid.
Deeply. It was riddled with intrigue, gossip, designed almost to expose weakness or disloyalty. Not a welcoming place for anyone, let alone a teenage German princess dropped right into the middle of it.
And she was caught between factions, wasn't she? The pro-Russian nobles versus the sort of German foreign group.
Immediately. The old Russian families were deeply suspicious of outsiders, especially Germans. Gaining their trust was her primary challenge, and frankly, as a 15-year-old foreigner, it seemed almost impossible.
So how did she even begin to navigate that? Her official in was the marriage, right? To Grand Duke Peter?
Yes, the betrothal was her entry ticket. It was meant to legitimize her presence. But, ironically, Peter himself turned out to be perhaps her biggest political liability during those early years.
Tell us about him. The sources paint a pretty vivid picture. Peter III, grandson of Peter the Great.
Born 1728. Physically strong, apparently, but described consistently as immature, impulsive, and crucially, he had zero interest in actual Russian governance.
More interested in playing soldiers.
Obsessed with it. Trilling his personal regiment of soldiers from Holstein, his birthplace. He was awkward socially, hated court etiquette, just completely out of step with what was expected.
There's that famous story. Did he really put a rat on trial?
The sources mention it, yes. Apparently executed a rat for chewing the heads off his toy soldiers. Whether it's strictly true or not, it paints a picture, doesn't it? Volatile, absolute power combined with a very fragile ego. That's who Catherine was tied to.
So their relationship must have been difficult from the start, purely formal.
Pretty much. And deeply complicated by his moves and unpredictability, which meant her actual influence initially was basically zero. She couldn't tell him what to do, couldn't guide him, couldn't lead.
That sounds incredibly limiting.
It was, but that very constraint, paradoxically, might have been the making of her. It forced her into a different strategy.
Which was?
Since she couldn't act directly, she focused everything on observation. This is where you really see her intelligence shine through. She was stuck in the Winter Palace, mostly ceremonial duties, constantly watched.
But she turned that surveillance back on itself.
Exactly. She turned her confinement into an intelligence-gathering exercise for 18 years.
So she was basically building a mental database of the court.
You could say that.
Okay.
Systematically noting down behavior, who was allied with whom, what were their weaknesses. Nobles, officials, even Peter himself. All while appearing to do nothing but attend ceremonies. It was covert leadership training.
Gaining respect not through power, which she didn't have, but through knowing more than anyone else.
Precisely. Through her intelligence, her social adaptability, her charm when needed, she learned the court inside out. And remember, the context, Russian succession wasn't exactly stable. Empress Elizabeth held absolute power, but what came next was uncertain. Catherine needed to understand the real levers of power, not just the official ones.
And while she was doing all this observing, this strategic waiting game, she was also educating herself in other ways.
Yes, crucially. She didn't just focus on court gossip. She kept up her intellectual pursuits. Reading Russian literature, yes, but also deeply engaging with European Enlightenment thinkers.
Voltaire, Montesquieu.
The big names. So she's forming her own ideas about governance, about philosophy, while simultaneously watching this very unenlightened, often brutal court reality play out in front of her.
How did she connect those two things, the abstract ideas and the grubby reality of power?
That's the fascinating part. Her reading wasn't just a hobby. It seems to have informed who she decided to cultivate as allies. She wasn't just looking for powerful people. She was looking for competent people, strategically useful people, maybe even people who shared some of her intellectual leanings.
So moving from just observing to actively building a network.
Exactly. The observation phase led directly into application. She started carefully cultivating relationships, not just any courtiers, but influential ones, and critically, key figures of the military, people who understood structure, planning, efficiency.
People who might be useful later.
People who would be useful later. Her success wasn't handed to her. She built it, piece by piece, over those 18 years.
So the takeaway from this whole apprenticeship period is...
It's undeniable, really. She learned that power in that Russian context depended on mastering the culture, mastering the language, building her own reputation completely separate from her husband's, and forging strategic alliances that went deeper than just courtly manners.
It really is an incredible story when you lay it out like that. 18 years. The harsh journey, the forced conversion, having almost no influence, just watching, learning, waiting.
That constant observation, the strategic silence. It forged the self-control, the calculation, the sheer intelligence that defined Catherine the Great.
It truly did.
And it leaves us with a really interesting question, I think, something for you, the listener, to ponder. Given how confined she was to the Winter Palace, the endless ceremonies, the constant watching eyes, how did that very environment, that lack of initial power, actually enable her to figure out how power worked so effectively? How did being forced to just observe for so long ultimately make her such a master strategist? That early survival demanded extraordinary discipline, didn't it? Skills she might never have honed if she'd started out with actual authority. In a way, the cage was her classroom. We're landing smack bang in 1762.
Right.
No time for the fancy coronation stuff.
Yeah.
This is right after the coup. Catherine's just taken the throne from Peter III.
Yeah, the dust hasn't even settled yet. She's looking out at this immense, incredibly diverse Russian empire.
And it's rigid, right?
Yeah.
Socially, I mean,
Yeah.
super hierarchical.
Oh, absolutely brutal. That hierarchy and just the sheer size of the place, that's the backdrop for everything she tries to do between 62 and, say, 1775.
She needs legitimacy, fast.
Exactly. And her power base, it's the nobility, the boyars. These aren't just wealthy folks. They hold real entrenched power, especially locally.
And everyone else.
Well, mostly serfs, millions of them. And then you've got the Orthodox Church, which is deeply woven into the fabric of the state. It's inseparable, really.
So this is the inheritance. Traditional, maybe a bit volatile,
Yeah.
but her goals are, well, they sound pretty modern.
They are. Two big things. First, lock down her own power. Absolutely essential after a coup. Second, she wants to modernize the administration, the whole system.
And project that enlightened image everyone was talking about in Europe.
Precisely. She wants Russia to be seen as rational, modern. But here's the central problem, the real tightrope walk.
Go on.
How do you push reforms based on Enlightenment ideas, liberty, rational law, all that, when the very people you need support from, the nobility?
Their entire system is based on serfdom, the opposite of enlightened.
You got it. Their wealth, their status, it all rests on this fundamentally unenlightened institution. That's the core tension.
Okay, let's dig into that. The legal side seems like the obvious place to start. The nakaz, the instruction from 1767.
Right, the nakaz. This was meant to be her big legal statement, a plan to overhaul and modernize Russian law completely.
And it leaned heavily on Enlightenment thinkers.
Oh, massively. You can basically see Montesquieu and Beccaria right there on the page. Ideas about separation of powers, definitely about penal reform, reducing torture, that kind of thing.
So really progressive ideas for the time. Equality before the law, rational courts. Sounds amazing on paper.
Theoretically, yes. It was making a huge statement to Europe as much as to Russia. Like, look, we're part of this modern philosophical movement.
But was it just theory? You mentioned it was a statement aimed at who? Voltaire. Or was it meant for real internal change?
That's the million-ruble question, isn't it? Critics definitely suggested it was partly, maybe mostly, political theater for her philosopher friends abroad.
So limited impact. Why would the nobles resist a clearer legal code? Wouldn't that benefit them in some ways?
You'd think so, but clarity and centralization were threats to their customary local power. A universal code might limit their personal control over their estates, their serfs.
So standard procedures reduce their personal authority.
Exactly. They preferred the old ways where their word was basically law locally, so the really progressive bits, they got bogged down. Resistance, bureaucracy, the usual suspects.
So its immediate effect was more symbolic then, a signal to Europe.
Largely, yes. It showed Russia was civilized and thinking modern thoughts, but it didn't radically shake up the domestic power structure right away.
Okay, so if the big legal overhaul stalled, the practical stuff became more important, like just making the government machine run better.
Precisely. She couldn't just abandon governance, so she focused on administrative fixes, reorganizing territories, trying to make local authorities a bit more streamlined, tackling corruption, which was rampant.
Making the state actually functional across that huge territory.
Yeah, basic stuff like collecting taxes effectively, supplying the army. It was about codifying things enough to centralize authority, so she was in control, while still keeping the nobles happy enough not to cause trouble. A tricky balance.
It sounds like when the high-minded legal reforms hit that bureaucratic wall, she shifted tactics, maybe towards culture, something more visible.
Absolutely. Culture became a major focus. If the laws were slow to change, maybe the people, well, the elite people could change faster. Or at least look like they had.
Patron of the arts.
Oh, big time. Lavish funding for theater, opera, architecture, painting. She was essentially trying to cultivate a European-style elite in St. Petersburg, rebranding the Russian nobility.
And education was key to that,
Yeah.
right? State schools for nobles.
Yes. A really significant push. Schools for noble boys, emphasizing literacy, languages, history, science, the standard Enlightenment package. But also, crucially, for girls.
The Smolny Institute in 1764. That feels genuinely ahead of its time.
Yeah.
State education for women.
It really was a landmark. Russia's first state-funded school specifically for women, and the curriculum wasn't just finishing school stuff, it was languages, history, sciences.
Aimed at creating, what, educated wives.
Pretty much, creating cultured, rational wives and mothers who could manage households and, importantly, raise the next generation of this modern Europeanized elite. It showed educating women was now seen as vital for the state's image and health.
And outside Russia, she was cultivating this image directly with big thinkers.
Oh yeah, her correspondence network was legendary. Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, she was writing to all of them constantly.
Like hiring the world's best philosophers as PR consultants.
That's actually a great way to put it. She used them brilliantly. They sang her praises as a philosopher queen, which played incredibly well in European courts.
And that helped position Russia as modern, maybe distracting from the less modern stuff happening internally.
Definitely. It helped shape the narrative. Meanwhile, she also encouraged publishing within Russia literature, educational texts, feeding this new intellectual climate among the elite she was trying to foster.
Which brings us right back to that core problem, that massive contradiction. Promoting Enlightenment ideals while needing the nobles.
It's the heart of it. She made a very clear political trade-off. She needed the nobility's support for her rule, for her reforms, such as they were.
And in return,
She didn't just tolerate their existing privileges, she actively confirmed and even strengthened them, especially their total control over the serfs.
so all that talk in the Nakaz about equality before the law, it just didn't apply to most people.
Not in practice, no. The serfs, the vast majority, their lives didn't really change much during this specific period. They were still bound to the land, subject to the whims of their owners.
Because changing serfdom was just too risky.
Fundamentally, serfdom was the bedrock of the economy, especially agriculture. Messing with it seriously risked upsetting the nobles, potentially causing chaos, even civil war. She might have written privately about improving their lot, but politically, it was hands-off. It was cemented.
What about the church? The Enlightenment wasn't always friendly to organized religion. Did she challenge the Orthodox Church?
Very carefully. She needed the church for legitimacy, for social stability. It was a pillar of the old order she still relied on.
But she made some moves.
Some moderate ones. She secularized some church lands, which brought revenue to the state, and tried to limit the church's control over education a bit. But she couldn't push too hard. The clergy were powerful. She needed both nobles and the church on side.
Okay, so economically, serfs are the base for agriculture, which is still dominant, but she's pushing for modern economic growth too.
Yes, definitely. Big focus on trade, encouraging domestic manufacturing, trying to boost commerce, especially with Europe. And investing in infrastructure was part of that.
Roads, canals.
Exactly. And urban planning, particularly in St. Petersburg, but also Moscow, Novgorod, making the cities themselves look and function more like modern European commercial centers.
Let's picture St. Petersburg then. It must have been quite a scene. This new European architecture, the court life.
Incredible spectacle, palaces popping up in Baroque, neoclassical styles, trying to outdo Versailles. And the social scene, the balls, the salons, the theater wasn't just fun, it was where politics happened, where influence was traded. That glittering surface was vital.
But underneath that surface, the reality of governing this huge, cold place.
Right, you've got these magnificent palaces, but then think about heating them when it's minus 20 Celsius outside.
Minus 15 to minus 25. Yeah, that's properly cold.
And that cold affects everything. Travel, communication, moving supplies, just getting government business done. It makes that bureaucratic inefficiency even worse. It's a constant fight against geography and the deep freeze.
So the main drags on her reforms during this time were noble resistance and bureaucracy.
Those were the big internal challenges, yes. The nobles feared losing their privileges, and she couldn't afford to lose their support. And the sheer inertia and inefficiency of the existing administration just slowed everything down.
Leading to that tension. The enlightened image versus the messy reality of ruling.
Constantly. What looked good in a letter to Voltaire often didn't translate easily into policy on the ground in, say, Siberia.
She wasn't doing this alone, though. Who are the key people around her helping navigate this?
Oh, a crucial team. You had figures like Grigory Orlov, her lover, yes, but also a key military backer from the coup. He represented raw power, court influence.
And others.
Count Nikita Penin, he was hugely important. A top advisor, diplomat, really central to foreign policy, but also education reform. Maybe a bit more cautious, pragmatic than Orlov, representing the need to manage the old guard.
And the philosophers.
Well, they weren't physically there, but Voltaire and Diderot were providing that intellectual framework, the philosophical justification for her rule, constantly reinforcing her enlightened image abroad.
It's interesting. You mentioned serfdom was cemented. Widespread revolt, like Pugachev's rebellion, that comes later,
Yeah.
right? After this initial period.
Yes, the massive Pugachev rebellion is just after this window, in the mid-1770s. But the sources suggest the conditions for that kind of unrest were already being laid, or at least solidified, during these years.
By confirming noble power over serfs, even while talking about enlightenment.
Exactly. By prioritizing noble loyalty and stability now, she was arguably deepening the fundamental injustice and contradictions that would explode later. She bought time, but maybe at the cost of worsening the underlying problem.
So, summing up this 1762-1775 period,
Hmm.
what's the takeaway? She uses Enlightenment ideas, centralizes power, modernizes the elite culture.
But it's all fundamentally constrained, limited by the absolute political need to keep the traditional power structure, nobility, and serfdom intact.
She used the language of Enlightenment.
Not really to dismantle the old system, but more to legitimize her own position at the top of it, to make absolutism look modern and palatable, especially to Europe.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something
Yeah.
for you, the listener, to chew on. What's the real price of this enlightened absolutism?
Yeah, when your ideology talks up universal rights, like in the Nakaz, but your political survival depends on maintaining serfdom and rigid hierarchies, which force actually wins out in shaping the state?
And did her reforms, even the symbolic ones, the schools, the letters, the image crafting, did they genuinely pave the way for deeper change later? Or did they just put a modern veneer on the fundamental problems, maybe even delaying real reckoning by making the elite feel progressive without tackling the core injustice?
Something to think about. Did it sow seeds for the future, or just deepen the empire's contradictions?
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving straight into the golden age of Russian expansion under Catherine the Great. Specifically, we're focusing on those incredible, really strategic territorial gains she secured between, what, the 1770s and 1780s. This wasn't just passive growth. This was Russia actively transforming itself, through calculated military campaigns, diplomacy, becoming the dominant power in Eastern Europe. Our mission today is to zero in on the core strategies, those specific victories, and the long-term outcomes that really define this transformative era.
Absolutely. And to really grasp the scale of what she achieved, you have to appreciate the context first. By the time Catherine was ready to push hard, say in the 1770s, Russia was already, well, an established centralized empire. They had a professional army, right? Backed by this nobility-centered social structure. And the Orthodox Church provided a kind of cultural glue. Catherine's goals were always very pragmatic, very focused. First, secure Russia's vulnerable southern and western borders with definite territorial gains. And second, enhance Russia's international prestige. Get it to the point where no major European conflict could be sorted out without St. Petersburg having a say. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the whole 18th century really offered a perfect storm of opportunity. You had the Ottoman Empire in visible, accelerating decline, struggling to keep up technologically, militarily, and at the same time, Poland-Lithuania was politically fractured, weakened by internal squabbles. These two situations basically offered the perfect staging ground for aggressive Russian expansion, south and west.
Right. And the South is where that really dramatic confrontation happened first. The Russo-Turkish War, 1768 to 1774, wasn't about high ideals, was it? It was purely about securing vital economic and military assets. We're talking about that urgent Russian desire for warm water ports, for definite access to the Black Sea, which was pretty much an Ottoman lake back then. And that desire drove a pretty spectacular demonstration of military skill. Here's where it gets really interesting. Can you break down maybe one specific element? What made commanders like Rumyantsev's tactics genuinely modern compared to their Ottoman counterparts? The victory at Kogul in 1770 is always cited as decisive, but what were the Russians doing differently on the battlefield?
Well, the difference was largely organizational and technological. While the Ottomans still relied heavily on sort of feudal levies and the Janissary Corps, the Russian army under Catherine had been fundamentally reformed. They really embraced combined arms maneuvers, that close coordination of infantry, cavalry, and especially field artillery. That was key. At Kogul, Rumyantsev used these squares of well-drilled infantry, backed by mobile, powerful field guns, and they just overwhelmed the less flexible Ottoman formations. That victory, plus the quick, successful siege of Ochakov that same year, which locked down the southern approaches it, showed Europe that the Russian military machine was now, well, a first-rate modern power.
Okay, so that military power paid off massively with the Treaty of Kusinarka in 1774. This treaty didn't just end a war, it fundamentally rewrote the map, didn't it?
It absolutely did. A huge shift. Russia secured significant new territorial rights, including parts of that crucial southern steppe land, very fertile. They gained full navigational rights on the Black Sea, opening up vital trade routes. That was huge economically. Crucially, they were granted limited autonomy over the Crimean Khanate, a status that, well, wouldn't last long. And perhaps most enduringly, they won the right to intervene as the official protector of Orthodox Christians living within Ottoman lands. Now, this protector clause wasn't just humanitarian, it was a permanent diplomatic lever. It gave Russia perpetual justification to meddle in Ottoman internal affairs, basically ensuring future conflict.
That limited autonomy over Crimea, clearly just stepping stone. As you said, Catherine was committed to taking the Khanate outright, which she did in 1783, a very deliberate act of annexation. Crimea was a strategic jewel, providing that crucial year-round warm water port, total coastal dominance. But I'm a bit surprised that annexation didn't immediately draw in Britain or France or trigger some massive coalition war. What was Catherine doing diplomatically to keep the other European powers sort of neutralized during that really aggressive 1783 move?
That is the pivotal question, isn't it? It was a masterpiece of 18th century diplomacy, backed by the clear threat of force. Catherine relied heavily on her chief administrator in general, Grigory Potemkin, to make the acquisition a fait accompli, a done deal, before the rest of Europe could really react cohesively. Potemkin rapidly deployed the newly formed Russian Black Sea Fleet, started building massive fortifications, basically making it militarily costly for anyone to jump in. Plus, Catherine carefully managed her relationships with Austria and Prussia. She made sure they were either busy elsewhere or maybe slightly placated by the promise of future gains, which of course brings us to Poland.
Exactly. Securing the South was step one, but Catherine simultaneously had this completely different strategic calculation running in the West. The target. The vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Unlike the Ottoman Empire, which was a clear military rival, Poland was, well, a state collapsing from within. That fractured nobility, external influence.
Right. Poland's internal weaknesses, combined with those external pressures, just made it ripe for picking. Catherine's method here wasn't outright war, not initially anyway. It was a sophisticated use of internal political manipulation, military backing for favored Polish factions, playing into the game from within.
And this political maneuvering turned into an incredible display of what we now call realpolitik. Can you maybe briefly define that for us?
Certainly. The division itself, the partitions, were textbook examples of 18th century realpolitik. That means purely pragmatic, power over principle diplomacy, state interests, military might, territorial gain. They trump all moral or legal considerations. Since they couldn't risk a massive war over Poland, Russia, Prussia under Frederick the Great, and Austria under Maria Theresa simply agreed to slice it up amongst themselves. So this led to the first partition in 1772. Russia gained significant eastern lands, mostly parts of Livonia and Belarus. And this collaboration, this three-way split, ensured that no single major European power would object too strongly because, well, everyone important got a piece of the pie.
Okay, so the key difference between the Polish and Ottoman strategy was that in Poland, Russia actually worked with rivals like Austria and Prussia to systematically dismantle a state rather than fighting them alone.
Precisely. A very different approach. And that wasn't the end of it, of course. Russia kept pushing, exploiting subsequent Polish unrest, which led to further expansion in the second partition in 1793. They ended up gobbling up western Belarus and a large chunk of Ukraine. The result wasn't just territorial gain, it was a massive explosion of Russian influence across Eastern Europe. It established this immense security buffer against Western rivals and placed key trade routes firmly under imperial control.
Now, all these successful campaigns across the steppes, through sieges, across borders, they were all underpinned by the engine of war, right? Catherine's military organization reforms. We know she professionalized the army, moved away from older, less reliable models. But how critical were specifics like merit-based promotion in ensuring that success continued?
Oh, absolutely vital. Merit-based promotion for officers was essential for building a competent, long-term officer corps. It meant that talented commanders, people like Rumyantsev or Potemkin, weren't blocked just because of their birth. They could rise rapidly based on battlefield success, administrative skill. This created a culture of competence that, frankly, the Ottomans often lacked at that time. And furthermore, they developed the navy significantly. You had the maintenance of the Baltic fleet, sure, but also the rapid buildup of the new Black Sea fleet to secure maritime dominance once those southern ports were acquired. This required huge funding, massive logistical foresight, and we also have to acknowledge the sheer scale of the logistical challenge these armies faced. Fighting across those massive open steppe plains, dealing with harsh winters, needing to supply men and artillery hundreds of miles from Moscow, relying heavily on rivers, captured fortresses. It needed military geniuses, yes, but also brilliant administrators.
That brings us back perfectly to those key figures. We've mentioned the battlefield brilliance of Count Pyotr Rumyantsev, but tell us a bit more about Grigory Potemkin. He wasn't just a military commander, was he? He was more than that.
Potemkin was, well, indispensable. He was the chief architect of the southern expansion, the administrative mastermind behind New Russia, as they called it. His job wasn't just to conquer territory, but to secure it, settle it, govern it, these newly acquired southern lands, including Crimea. This meant complex diplomacy with local populations, rapid construction of roads, towns, establishing the Black Sea ports. It was a task of immense complexity, absolutely crucial to integrating these lands into the empire, transforming them from just buffer zones into actual economic engines.
Okay, so after this whole tour of geopolitical successes, let's bring it home. Why should you, our listener, care about these territorial shifts nearly 250 years later? What was the real domestic impact of all this massive expansion?
Well, the key domestic impact was the consolidation of Catherine's own authority. She used the success of expansion to stabilize her regime internally. Remember, she came to power via a coup. The powerful nobility, whose support was absolutely critical, were generously rewarded. Vast tracts of land, hundreds of thousands of serfs in those newly acquired southern territories. This system of land grants created a specific political economy in New Russia that tied the loyalty of the elite directly to imperial success and, frankly, their personal prosperity.
And economically, the results were pretty dramatic, weren't they?
Oh, immediately dramatic, yes. Access to those incredibly rich, fertile agricultural lands in the south, combined with control over new trade routes and those acquired ports like Sevastopol and Odessa, which Potemkin developed, drove massive revenue back to the crown. And this funding, in turn, provided the foundation for future military and political moves. So what does this all mean for the people on the ground? The expansion definitely reinforced Catherine's authoritarian rule, helped suppress potential revolts. Proving military success often buys domestic stability, at least for the rulers, but we must never forget the cost. Serfs were routinely drafted into the army, often forcibly relocated to settle and farm these vast new territories. So the glory of the empire, it was built on a foundation of profound human displacement and suffering, especially for the lowest classes.
That really brings all our threads together perfectly, I think. Catherine's reign was defined by this calculated, strategic territorial expansion. It was secured through modernized military might, brilliant leadership like Potemkin and Rumyantsev, and that incredibly deft realpolitik diplomacy, even negotiating with rivals like Prussia and Austria to systematically dismantle a neighbor. This era permanently secured Russia's access to the sea and really created the geopolitical foundation for the colossal Russian Empire that would dominate the continent for the next century.
Exactly. And if Catherine's stated primary goals were, as we discussed, enduring security and prestige, we are left with this question for you, the listener, to consider based on what we've talked about. Which of her territorial acquisitions, Crimea with its irreplaceable warm water port and valuable resources, or the Polish lands, which served as that vast security buffer and controlled essential trade routes, which one ultimately proved the more enduring cornerstone of the Russian Empire for the next century? Think about that balance between, say, natural resources and geopolitical security as you mull it over. We're going straight into the real mechanics of her power to figure out how she ran this massive empire. We're not starting with, treaties or grand diplomacy. We're actually looking right at her court. Because the sources, while they seshed her private life and the state, weren't just linked. They were basically the same thing. Her inner circle was the executive branch.
That's exactly it. That's the core idea we really need to unpack from these sources. Our mission, if you like, is to decode this system, this private governance, this setup where, well, intimacy was almost a requirement for real influence. It created this control mechanism that was, super effective, but also inherently a bit shaky. She used her favorites, her lovers, as direct administrators, military planners, even intelligence sources. It let her completely bypass the slow, old bureaucracy.
Okay, right. So let's get into that efficiency. It sounds almost startlingly modern in a way. Starting with the big players. the favorites. You really can't study Catherine's political life without seeing that her romantic partners were also basically running state departments. They weren't just decorative figures. They were real political actors giving her, like you said, rapid response.
Precisely. Look at Grigory Orlov. He wasn't just an early lover. He was well, the muscle that secured her throne in the first place. The sources really emphasize how instrumental he was in the 1762 coup. Just critical. Without that incredibly personal loyalty and his direct line to military units, well, there might not have been an Empress Catherine. He was, for a time, the most trusted man she had, and that alone gave him authority way beyond any official title, especially in those first few unstable years.
And then, of course, there's the name everyone knows, Grigor Potemkin, the long-term figure. People know he was powerful, sure, but what did being her close advisor and partner actually let him do on the ground administratively?
Oh, it let him operate almost completely outside the normal chains of command. Potemkin's role, it wasn't just military leadership. He was basically the governor, the administrator of that entire southern region, Novorossiya. When he was overseeing the huge project of annexing Crimea, he wasn't going through committees, not at all. He was building stuff, deploying troops, planning strategy, and reporting directly only to Catherine. This super streamlined process, built on just absolute personal trust, it allowed for geopolitical moves at a speed the regular Russian state machine just couldn't touch.
And we see this pattern again and again, right? Even if maybe for shorter times or with less administrative weight, the sources point to others, like Stanislaw Poniatowski, the Polish noble. That wasn't just personal, was it? Highly political choice, fathering her son. It's this blend again. It really feels like she was actively building this network based on usefulness and devotion.
Absolutely. She was curating it. The system made sure loyalty came first. But, and this is important, that loyalty had a price tag. While this private network meant she could act fast in crises, like the coup or during military campaigns, it also stirred up massive friction internally. The sources are very clear on this. She wasn't just getting trusted advisors. She was creating this super competitive, sometimes, frankly, toxic environment right at the top.
So, okay, if the sources paint her as a political genius for setting this up, they must also show how much sheer effort she had to pour into just managing the fallout. Was this system, maybe on a human level, actually kind of inefficient for her personally?
That's exactly the downside the material points to.
Right.
The constant draining management it required. The favorites were always, jockeying for position, for influence, for wealth. It caused huge rivalries between the big noble families. They didn't just give advice. They pushed their own allies for jobs. They sometimes subtly sabotaged rivals' policies. So if you pull back, Catherine had to be the supreme ruler, yes, but also this constant high-stakes referee, always managing the egos, the demands, the emotional states for most powerful people.
That intense rivalry among the few kind of brings us to the wider court scene in St. Petersburg. If juggling 2 or 3 favorites was tough, how did she handle all the established factions buzzing around her? The court itself must have been this political minefield of different loyalties.
Oh, it absolutely was a constant balancing act. The sources show, broadly, maybe 3 main blocks she had to deal with. First, her base. The pro-Russian nobles, the military guys, the bureaucrats who really owed their careers to her. They were her bedrock. Second, there was always this lingering threat. The German or other foreign-born courtiers, some still had quiet loyalty to Peter III, the guy she deposed, or maybe they were linked to other European powers, a potential 5th column almost. And third, you had the clergy, representing the huge institutional power of the Orthodox Church and, Russian tradition itself. A very different kind of power.
Right, so she had to juggle tradition, reward her loyalists, but also look modern and European. This sounds like where her famous patronage system really kicks in. It wasn't just giving titles away, was it? It sounds more systematic.
Oh, incredibly systematic. This gets to the heart of what we mean by private governance. The sources suggest Catherine controlled this enormous number of positions, civil, military, maybe 10,000 appointments across the whole empire. Her favorites and that trusted inner circle, they acted like her personal HR department for the very top jobs. Getting appointed whether military command, a civil post, even something in arts or education depended on, yes, personal loyalty, but also proven competence. She needed people who could actually do the job. She was strategically placing loyal, capable people to carry out her plans and, crucially, stabilize the throne she'd won in a coup.
And it's important, like you said, that this inner circle wasn't just about romance. The sources bring up key figures like Count Nikita Panin. He wasn't a lover, but he was her main diplomatic advisor, right? Kind of mentored her in European politics.
Exactly.
She built a team based on what they could do for her, whether that was military power, strategic thinking, or diplomatic skill.
That's a really vital point. Proximity bred trust, And trust opened the door to political usefulness. Pin handled the high-level diplomacy. Potemkin handled expansion, administration, the military side. It was a network designed for maximum effectiveness, cutting out the slow committees and making sure all the critical info flowed straight back to her, the Empress.
Okay, let's try and step inside that world now. We've talked about the political machine, but what was it actually like day to day in her palaces? The Winter Palace, Tsarskoye Selo. How did she use that daily routine, the culture, the whole environment to project this image of being a legitimate, enlightened ruler?
Well, the court was kind of a gilded cage, where every little thing, every gesture was political. The sources describe these palaces run on incredibly strict, formal etiquette. Daily life wasn't just ruling, it was a performance. She had to balance the real work meeting ambassadors, reviewing stacks of state papers with constant cultural activity, hosting salons, going to the theater, overseeing educational projects. She knew, especially coming to power the way she did, that legitimacy had to be actively constructed, built.
Ah, so the famous embrace of European styles, French styles, especially in fashion, buildings, art, that wasn't just her taste, it was strategic.
Absolutely strategic. Cultural patronage was a key tool of statecraft for her. By adopting and crucially funding the highest forms of European Enlightenment culture, the fancy balls, the plays, the sophisticated dinners, she was sending a message. She was projecting modernity, rationality, good taste. This was vital for winning approval from other European powers. And it helped cement her image with the Russian nobility too, showing she was progressive, the rightful ruler moving Russia forward.
But underneath all the silk and the music, the risk was always there. This whole system, so personalized, so efficient in one way, was also incredibly vulnerable, wasn't it? Because the entire thing rested on her personality, her ability to manage all these relationships.
Totally. The sources show she was incredibly smart, politically very sharp. She used this careful mix of being firm but also charming to keep people loyal. She was constantly scanning for threats, using her advisors and reading massive amounts of letters to keep tabs on basically everyone who mattered. She had to be that vigilant because the threat wasn't theoretical, it was real and present.
Which brings us to maybe the most dangerous part of this whole conversation. Security. Are you saying this entire system, the favorites, the patronage network, even the cultural stuff, it was all operating under this constant shadow of potential violence against her personally?
That was the inherent danger of such intimate governance. The sources are quite blunt about it. Assassination plots, whispers of coups, political backstabbing, these are ongoing concerns throughout her whole reign. She had this double challenge, managing the intense jealousy among her favorites. I mean, who might turn on her if they felt overlooked? And at the same time, balancing traditional Russian ways with the European Enlightenment ideas she promoted. Any whiff of scandal, any rumor, any sign of weakness connected to her private life could be instantly seized upon by enemies inside Russia to spark a crisis. Her genius, really, was keeping that highly centralized, deeply personal political machine running for more than 30 years. But the sources really remind us of the sheer, almost crippling level of vigilance and paranoia that must have required.
So, Catherine the Great really didn't have a private life separate from her public duty. She fused them. She created this lightning-fast executive based purely on personal trust, loyalty, security, and just relentless management of ambition and ego.
Exactly right. Her personal network was her state security. It was her rapid deployment force. And it gave her incredible political agility. But this brings up a really interesting final thought for you, the listener, to chew on, based on this material. Her system worked remarkably well for her time, but what does its deep reliance on managing the emotions of her inner circle tell us about the long-term health, the vulnerability of such a huge empire? If your whole political engine needs constant, high-energy emotional refereeing, and if a rivalry between top advisors is a major political headache, what happens to that system the instant that central figure, that manager-in-chief, is gone, or even just looks away for a moment? The very end of her, 34-year reign?
Exactly. And our mission today is to cut through some of the myths and really look at the high-stakes decisions she was making right at the end.
Because this wasn't her taking a victory lap. Not at all.
No, this was a furious 6-year dash to consolidate everything she'd built, all while Europe was, basically on fire. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, you can't talk about the 1790s without talking about the French Revolution. That is the backdrop for everything.
The ultimate political anxiety.
It's an existential threat. It kicks off in 1789, and suddenly every monarch in Europe is looking over their shoulder.
And Catherine, who had spent decades building this reputation as the enlightened monarch, corresponding with Voltaire.
Right. Suddenly finds herself in this impossible spot. She has to keep her massive, diverse empire stable.
Keep her own power absolute.
While the sort of virus of republicanism is just spreading everywhere.
And you can see that fear in the policy right away. Let's dive into that first part. Governing under European anxiety. It really is a study in political hardening.
It is. I mean, despite all the chaos, she never once wavered on the idea of absolute authority.
If anything, the sources show she used the threat from France to justify tightening her grip even more. She's building a fortress, not a...
Exactly. Not a democracy. It was all about control. Her focus wasn't just foreign policy, it was internal counter-revolution.
So how did she do that? How did she keep a lid on things?
Well, she was incredibly shrewd. First, she made sure the nobility stayed loyal, the people with the real power out in the provinces.
And how did she do that?
She guaranteed their privileges, most importantly, their control over the serfs. She knew not to touch that.
Untouchable. And at the same time, she's pouring money into the military.
A huge amount. The budgets show a clear priority. Make the army professional, well-funded, and, most importantly, politically loyal.
So projects strength outwards to enforce obedience inwards.
That's the formula. And you have to remember the scale we're talking about. This isn't a small European kingdom.
It's a multi-ethnic empire stretching across continents.
And while the elites in St. Petersburg are reading French philosophy,
The vast majority of the population are serfs living in pretty brutal conditions.
which is why that ideological firewall was so important to her. The fear wasn't just French armies, it was French ideas.
And that's when the censorship really ramps up.
Oh, exponentially. Works by thinkers she used to tolerate, even admire, were suddenly banned outright around 1794. She goes from being this intellectual patron to a reactionary.
And all this is happening while she's in her 60s, from 60 to 67. The sources say her health was starting to decline, but mentally...
Mentally, she was as sharp as ever, completely engaged. This wasn't a quiet retirement. She was pushing policy right up until the very end.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because she's not just reacting, she's actively building. Let's get into the concrete work of these later years.
That's a great point. It wasn't just about holding the line. One of her biggest achievements was overhauling Russia's bureaucracy, and she spent these last years perfecting it.
Okay, so the sources talk about the refinement of the provincial governance system. That sounds a little dry. What does that actually mean for people?
It means she was standardizing everything. Before her, a lot of provinces were run on the whims of the local nobility.
Right.
She brought in standardized tax collection, regional courts, even local police forces, and they all answered directly to St. Petersburg.
So she's taking power away from the local lords and centralizing it.
She's making the state machinery predictable and reliable. It's about getting revenue and getting conscripts for the army without any fuss.
And that machine was crucial because the empire was still growing, especially in the south.
Hugely. And her economic policies were all geared towards developing those new territories. Agriculture, trade, infrastructure.
This is where Grigory Potemkin comes in, right? Though he dies pretty early in this period.
He dies in 1791, and it leaves a huge void. He was the architect of that southern expansion, the Black Sea settlements, Crimea.
A massive loss for her, personally and politically.
It was. But she didn't let his vision die. She institutionalized it. She kept offering land grants, tax breaks, anything to get people to move south and secure Russia's grip on the Black Sea.
And her policies were always so practical. You see it in her approach to religion, too.
Absolutely. Her number one priority was her alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church. That was the ideological bedrock of her rule.
But she had all these new subjects in the new territories. Catholics in Poland, Muslims in the south.
Right, and her tolerance for them was purely pragmatic. It was a tool of governance, not some philosophical belief in pluralism.
So better to let them keep their religion than risk a rebellion.
Exactly. Forcing them to convert would have been explosive. It was just smart politics to maintain stability.
And if you look at the map from 1790 to 1796, the territorial gains are just staggering. She finishes the partitions of Poland, solidifies the southern border.
She fundamentally repositions Russia. It's not just a big country anymore. It's the dominant land power in Europe. End of story.
Which brings us to the most fascinating part of this whole story. Section 3, the Enlightenment Paradox.
Ah, yes. The great contradiction.
Because at the same time she's censoring authors and clamping down on dissent, she's also this huge patron of the arts and sciences.
It was a cultural explosion, but a very carefully managed one. It was for the elite, the nobility she needed to keep on her side.
So give us a tangible example of that.
Architecture. Look at the palaces in St. Petersburg. the renovations at the Catherine Palace. It's all neoclassical.
Which was the fashionable style, but you're saying there was more to it.
Much more. Neoclassicism is all about order, reason, stability, Roman virtues. It was a political message.
She's projecting an image.
She's telling Europe, look at us. We are rational, civilized, and orderly, unlike the chaos happening in Paris. She was literally building her legitimacy.
So this is the big question then. How do we square that circle? The enlightened monarch who loves art and philosophy with the ruler whose social reforms were, well, basically non-existent. Serfdom didn't change at all.
If anything, it got worse for the serfs in some ways.
So how do you explain it?
The short answer is she couldn't afford to change it. She knew serfdom was, morally wrong. She wrote about it. But the entire Russian state, the economy, the military, the tax base, was built on the backs of serfs. The nobility's wealth depended on it completely.
And she needed the nobility's support to stay in power.
To free the serfs would have meant bankrupting the state and facing a massive revolt from the one class that could actually overthrow her. Her hands were tied.
So it was a choice between her ideals and her crown.
And she chose the crown. Every single time.
And that practicality extends to how she ran her court, too. The sources are full of criticism about her use of personal favorites.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin. For all her brilliant bureaucracy, a lot of power was still informal.
And in the 1790s, we have to talk about Platon Zubov.
You do. Her last, and much younger, favorite. He ended up with an incredible amount of influence. He was like a de facto chief of staff.
So major decisions could be routed through him, bypassing the official channels she herself created.
That's right. And it's that mix of, genius administration and sometimes erratic personal favoritism that makes her so complex.
So the historical verdict is complicated.
Very. Everyone admires her intellect and her political skill. But you can't ignore the persistence of serfdom or the corruption at court. She was effective, ruthless, and just deeply contradictory.
Which brings us to the end, November 1796, at the Winter Palace.
The end came very suddenly. A stroke. She was gone within a day. And given her age and workload, it wasn't a total shock, but it still risked unleashing chaos.
And that chaos had a name, Paul I, her son.
Their relationship was, toxic might be an understatement. She deeply, deeply distrusted him.
Why? Yeah. What was the issue?
She thought he was erratic, unstable, obsessed with the Prussian military model, just completely unfit to rule Russia.
And the sources say she even considered skipping him in the line of succession.
She did. She thought about naming her grandson, Alexander, as her heir instead, which you can imagine created a ton of anxiety at court.
But in the end, she didn't do it.
No. For all her personal feelings, her political brain won out. She knew a succession crisis would be a disaster.
So she ensured a smooth transition of power to the son she couldn't stand.
It was her final act of statecraft. Preserving the dynasty and preventing civil war was more important than her personal dislike of Paul.
And we know she left him specific instructions, right? These warnings.
Yes, detailed notes on governance, on the military, on foreign policy. It was her last attempt to sort of impose her will on him from beyond the grave.
So when you connect all these dots, what is the big takeaway? What's her ultimate legacy?
It's the modernization of the Russian state. Full stop. She took a major regional power and turned it into a true European superpower. She strengthened the bureaucracy, professionalized the army, and built these incredible cultural institutions.
Russia's place on the world stage was cemented by her.
Absolutely. For better and for worse.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, the story of her final years is really this brutal balancing act. She's driving massive expansion and cultural flourishing with one hand.
And with the other, she's applying the brakes on any kind of social reform that might threaten her power base with the nobility.
She chose the stability of the state over the Enlightenment ideals she claimed to love.
And that formula, that cynical but, incredibly effective formula of adopting enlightened culture for show while maintaining absolute power in reality, that became a blueprint. It inspired and terrified Russian rulers for generations.
A powerful and pretty chilling summary. Okay, on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to consider. We know Catherine left specific warnings and instructions for Paul, the son she deeply distrusted.
Right.
Knowing his volatile nature.
So what was in them? What specific political fears about the French Revolution, about a potential coup, about the new territories was she trying to pass on? And how might those warnings have shaped the incredibly brief and troubled future of Russia under his reign? Thanks for diving deep with us.